stop outsourcing intuition to other people, to online, to social media. Like all of this healing, whether it's optimizing our metabolic function or microbiome health, that is a process that first starts taking place within. And I think we can actually do a much better job at trusting ourselves and our innate wisdom.
Hi, I'm Dr. Avanti Kumar Singh, and this is the Healing Catalyst podcast. I'm a medical doctor with over 20 years of experience and also a lifelong practitioner of Ayurveda. I created the Healing Catalyst podcast because we all deserve a different kind of conversation about health, one that's honest, holistic, and rooted in both science and soul. On this show, I'm joined by the world's leading experts to give you science-backed tools that you can start using today and actually stick with to build real health and longevity. I am so glad you're here. Now let's get to it. Hello, my beautiful friends. Welcome back to the Healing Catalyst podcast. I'm Dr. Avanti Kumar Singh, and today we are talking about something that I think is going to really connect a lot of dots for you. Because here's what I'm hearing from so many of you. You're tired. Not sleepy tired, but bone tired. The kind where you slept for 8 hours and you still woke up feeling like you didn't sleep at all. You're foggy by lunch. You're craving sugar by 3 p.m. Your body is changing in ways that don't make sense to you. And maybe you're gaining weight around your middle for the first time in your life. Maybe your periods are getting really irregular. Maybe you're having hot flashes and you're thinking, I'm not even 45. I'm not even 48. What is happening? And some of you are in a place that really doesn't get talked about much. You're trying to get pregnant and you're in your late 30s or your early 40s, and you're starting to feel perimenopausal symptoms at the same time. And nobody is connecting those dots for you. So you go to your doctor, they run labs, everything comes back normal, and you're left thinking, okay, then I guess it's just me. Well, it's not just you. What I want you to really hear today is that there's a root cause that connects so much of this. Your fertility, your perimenopausal symptoms, your energy, your brain fog, your weight, and that is your metabolic health. Now, as a doctor, I talk about this all the time. But what I love about today's conversation is how clearly my guest connects metabolic health to every stage of a woman's health across the arc of her health, from fertility to perimenopause to menopause. And she explains how simple it can be to support your metabolic health at any point along that arc. My guest today is Rachel Swanson, a registered dietitian with a master's in clinical nutrition from NYU. She's the nutrition director at Lifespan Medicine, the founder of Diet Doctors, and the author of the new book, Trying. She works with professional athletes, executives, and women who are navigating fertility and hormonal transitions. And her whole approach is root cause and whole body, which really aligns with how I think about health through an Ayurvedic lens. Today, we get into what poor metabolic health actually looks and feels like, because a lot of women are living with it and don't even know it. We talk about the 3 labs that Rachel thinks every woman should know and why the optimal numbers actually look very different from what your doctor might tell you is, quote, fine. We also get practical about what your plate should actually look like and talk about the gut microbiome connection that goes beyond estrogen detoxification. And we also get into environmental toxins, what to actually focus on and what to stop stressing out about. By the end of this conversation, you're going to understand the thread that connects so much of what you're experiencing, metabolic health, and you're going to walk away with some steps that you can take to support your metabolic health, regardless of where you are along the arc of women's health, fertility, perimenopause, or menopause. Let's get into it. Rachel, it's so great to be back with you again. I'm so happy. Thank you for doing this with me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, it is such a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. So, I was really taken by your new book, Trying, because, you're looking at foundational systems that drive everything: metabolic health, gut microbiome, environmental exposure, mitochondrial function, which is really connecting sort of these outcomes for women across every stage of life of women's health, from fertility to perimenopause to menopause. But here's something that's really interesting. And, I've had quite a few women ask me questions around this is that many women are living in this overlap period of trying to get pregnant in their late 30s, early 40s. And then maybe they're starting to start feeling the symptoms of perimenopause. It's sort of two things happening at once, but most conversations tend to treat them as separate events, and they're not. And so I really wanted to get into some of this because I know you really talk about this and a lot of your practice is around this area. So let's start with maybe the overlap that a lot of people aren't really talking about, which is women who are trying to have a baby, but they may also be starting to experience these perimenopausal symptoms like hot flashes or insomnia or brain fog or anxiety, right? Thinking that it's all about fertility, but it actually might be perimenopausal. So when a woman walks into your office and says that she's having trouble with fertility, what is the relationship between fertility or infertility and metabolic health?
Yeah, absolutely. I see metabolic health as such a huge potential leverage point, especially if that individual isn't, say, optimized in their metabolic function, like their insulin, for example, and their blood sugar. The reason for this is because it directly impacts our chances of conceiving as well as our IVF success, which I don't think many people know.
So then, when you have that situation, what should a woman do as far as fertility and metabolic health? What's the first step?
Yeah, so a lot of leverage points here. So, for example, if for that particular woman, if they have a body composition that isn't necessarily supportive of metabolic health, we would start there, right? We would start with energy balance. We would start with helping get her lean muscle mass up, right? And reducing body fat. So, that is one big leverage point of how we can immediately start to shift metabolic function and that inflammatory cascade that may be happening in our body that again is basically becoming a little bit of a biological roadblock or hurdle between her and her chances of getting pregnant. Also, recall that PCOS, which is really rampant in our country, what is at the root cause of that? It's insulin resistance. And so, what are like the things that we can start doing to optimize our insulin function? That is going to be exactly where we
Mhm.
start.
Okay. Amazing. So let's look at poor metabolic health because I know that that's a real big focus for you in your practice is talking about metabolic health as a root cause of so many of these symptoms. For a lot of the listeners, they may not even know what that looks like. What does poor metabolic health actually show up as? Because we can talk about it, but like, what does that look like, during an actual day, like in the morning or maybe in the middle of the day or when she wakes up in the middle of the night? How are these symptoms showing up for most women?
Yeah, well, in a variety of different ways, and this can manifest differently at different time points in our life. So, first, the 10,000-foot view, right? We're just talking about how efficiently our cells are making and using energy, and specifically, that comes down to the mitochondria within our cells. So, whatever is going on with our metabolic health, that can affect, say, inflammation in our body, which, as you know, also affects everyone, no matter what time point they are in their life, whatever goal they have. But yeah, just a day to day basis. So here's what women tend to describe it could be more of, this foggy thinking or brain fog, right? They just feel they aren't as sharp as they might have been. This can manifest with a lot of individuals about kind of poor energy throughout the day. So, for example, let's say after you eat lunch, a lot of people can describe the feelings of lethargy, right? Or they like almost needing to take a nap. It can manifest as craving. So, there are so many ways that this can be tackled, but the appetite, the cravings is one. We could get into how it affects the skin. I mean, that's how it's affecting though the day-to-day life. And so for metabolic health, again, taking a step back, I see it as something that is going to influence the trajectory of, say, ovarian aging or symptom reduction or trying to get at whatever their goal might be. But I just see this, how is this influencing their day-to-day life,
Right.
right? There's so
Mhm.
many touch points that this could just improve.
Mhm, mhm. And so many of these symptoms that we're talking about are sort of nonspecific. Like most women are like, I'm tired in the morning, or I'm brain fogged, or I feel lethargic after lunch. And so I guess maybe what you're kind of saying is that it's more often than not related to their metabolic health. And it may not even be something where they have to go down this like whole rabbit hole of like looking for answers. It's almost like the answer could be right there of looking at metabolic health first. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. What I'm saying is that there are so many things outside of our control, right? Let's take the individual in perimenopause where we're having a change in hormone function. My leverage point is like, okay, so yes, that is happening, but we need to also influence the cascade of inflammation that's happening in the body as well. Metabolic function, optimizing metabolic function, looking at that closer is going to be someone's leverage point for changing how they feel on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. So when you talk about leveraging and sort of like optimizing metabolic function, metabolic health, what exactly does that mean? So a woman comes in with all these sort of non-specific symptoms, but it affects their life in such a major way, right? Like we're talking about. Where do you start when you sit down with this patient? Where are you going to go first with them? Like take us through what you do with a patient.
Yeah, absolutely. So from the, I guess let's call it the Western perspective, right? Just so we can first lock into what metabolic health is. Like let's say if you go to a doctor, not you as a doctor, you're very integrative, right? Holistic in approach, but any doctor, they actually use criteria to look at metabolic health and metabolic function. And that again, you can like anyone can Google this. It's basically looking at your blood sugar, it's looking at certain lipid levels in your body, it's looking at blood pressure, right? So there's core criteria of how you're doing.
Sure.
That's arguably not the best criteria, but again, I just think it's nice to kind of have like this anchor point on how to evaluate it, right? So for me, I like to say like double click on some of those markers that are more important. That's going to tell us how, again, how is the body utilizing energy from our food? We can look at insulin function, we can look at blood sugar, we can look at glycosylated hemoglobin, which is kind of like a 3-month report card of blood sugar. So again, these kind of three simple labs is going to allow us to better understand where someone is kind of at their baseline and what they can work towards. Everyone is going to come to my office with a different baseline. So for some people, maybe that's not a leverage point that we focus on. But for most people, it certainly is because there's about 90% of our country has poor metabolic health. They aren't even in the criteria of what we define as optimal metabolic health. So again, huge room for improvement for our entire country. And so that's why it's a massive leverage point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess the question is then, like, when you talk about optimal metabolic health, what exactly is that? Because probably most women who are listening are like, well, okay, if I know that there's some metabolic issue, like, what am I striving for? Like, what is the goal here of what it should look like? Does that mean like a level blood sugar all day? Is it, a certain insulin sensitivity? What does that actually mean? And then let's talk about how you get there. Like what do we do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to be completely transparent in that the labs that I look for, it is not going to be the same as what, say, a doctor considers to be optimal, right? I'll give you a quick example.
Okay.
On the blood sugar front, if you go into your doctor and you have a blood sugar level of, say, 99, well, technically that doesn't meet the criteria of having diabetes, so you're just fine. So again, what is normal isn't necessarily optimal. That's
Sure.
why I use the word
Okay.
optimal because again, there's a slight gray area of what people all agree on, but I'm not going to wait until Western medicine like changes their lab. So essentially what we know is that individuals who have blood sugar that's 90 or less, fasting blood sugar, is typically going to be better in terms of long-term outcomes and disease trajectory than an individual with higher levels. And I'll give you a few examples of this in just a minute. For insulin, so essentially, I think if you go to like LabCorp or Quest and you see what is normal for insulin. One of them, it's like 24.9, which is ridiculous because
Mhm.
I would like individuals actually to move closer to, 6 or 7, which is a huge discrepancy between those two numbers, right?
Sure.
For
Right.
hemoglobin H1C, again, kind of looking at a 3-month-ish marker of literally how much sugar is stuck to your red blood cells. Again, from the diagnostic criteria is much different than what I consider optimal. And so I would like individuals to get closer to 5%, which again is much, much different compared to just what is normal. So if anyone listening to this actually knows those three labs off the top of their head and they are far from that, that should no way sort of incite anxiety or disappointment or any sort of negative emotions. Again, this is just saying I'm going to give some levels and we are going to do little refinements in our day to work us closer to those levels, but everyone is starting at a much different point. And again, that's going to be like some individuals that will require a lot of changes, some people maybe not so much. Again, everyone is starting from a much different place, and I do not want that to be kind of fear mongering in any way if right now you aren't close to that goal, and that's completely fine. So, before we go into sort of the actionable takeaways, I know I just kind of spewed all these labs at you, right? But let's discuss why does this matter for women at different time points in their life. So we're looking at these labs and this metabolic health, like let's call it in the context of fertility and pregnancy. We know that blood sugar, insulin, our metabolic health, it influences our egg quality, your partner's sperm quality, influences chances of conception, it influences the gene expression you pass down to your child, it influences complications in pregnancy, like developing hypertension or gestational diabetes. So that's kind of how I think about it for fertility and pregnancy. That's why these numbers are actually really important. For individuals who are at the stage of, say, perimenopause or menopause, I think about metabolic health like, sure, maybe you aren't interested in your egg quality and chances of conception, but your interest will shift in how can we influence your risk of, say, cardiovascular disease and cognitive decline. This is going to be your leverage point for changing outcomes, right? And it can
Right.
change your vasomotor symptoms as well.
Yeah. Okay. So let's maybe break it down by area. So let's talk about nutrition. So whether a woman's trying to get pregnant at 35 or managing hot flashes, at 45 or brain fog or anxiety, what does her plate need to look like through each meal? So let's look at it like breakfast, lunch, dinner. Like, how should we be adjusting what we're eating to really help with the glucose levels, the insulin levels, to really make sure that we're addressing whatever issues, whether it's fertility or cardiovascular health or any of the issues that we're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. So for each meal, a common shortcoming that I see is not eating enough protein with their meals. The reason why the protein is important, like yes, of course, for body composition and things like that, but for metabolic function, that's really going to help stabilize our blood sugar throughout the day. If you aren't stabilizing your blood sugar at, say, lunch, I know for a fact you're going to be really tired after that meal, right? Like you're probably going to feel like you need a nap, right? Or you have this again, like this brain fog or lethargy. And so that's why the protein aspect is very important with the meals, especially what I've noticed in practice is that if an individual has enough protein with, say, breakfast, what that really helps with too is their sugar cravings and their appetite for the rest of the day. Whereas I know I joke about it with some clients where it's like they have something very sugary, like they have the waffles off their kid's plate right in the morning when they're driving them to school or these sorts of things. What can happen is they're like, why am I hungry a few hours later? Or they'll be like,
Mhm.
I am already craving sugar, like and it's early in the day, right? So
Sure.
you kind of again it manifests differently, but the protein aspect is very, very important. Now, something else that I think about as again a very, very big leverage point and that I work with every single woman on is look at opportunities, whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, where we can essentially swap out some of the simple carbohydrates on your plate. So basically, the simple carbohydrates as opposed to complex carbohydrates, it's a
Mhm.
different in nutrient value and it's a different in fiber content.
Sure.
So when I say like simple carbs, white refined carbs, these are like the breads, the noodles, the waffles, like I just mentioned. So a lot of the foods that might be like if you have kids at home, that might be off of their plate or snacks that they might have, right? Because they're growing and actually need that energy and can actually take on all those extra calories. But I am going to do that no matter what. Again, someone could be coming in their 35, someone could be coming in their 65. We're going to walk through on a day-to-day basis and look at where those opportunities are. Because I think your audience, everyone listening right now, they'll already have the understanding that it's like, okay, do what you can to limit the sugar and the added sugar. But I think people a lot of times forget that this is also a big leverage point for the actual meals themselves. If there's any vegetarian or vegans listening, where are kind of the non-protein starches in the meals? Like, for example, for beans, we wouldn't touch those, right? If that's like one of the main protein sources. But what I would tackle is saying, like, okay, well, in this soup or stew or plate, is there a way that we can maybe like remove some of the grains or maybe some of the potatoes and replace those with some
Sure.
cruciferous vegetables that that person likes? So again, it'll be very, very different depending on the composition of the meal and the preferences of that individual. But the same kind of bedrock is going to be the same for the simple carbs. So those are just a few nutritional tips, takeaways.
Yeah. As you're saying this, what's bringing up for me too is also the interplay of the gut microbiome in this, right? Because gut microbiome, sugar, they all go together because, again, you want to have this healthy, balanced gut microbiome. And obviously, sugar feeds certain gut microbiome that may not be so good for you. And then there's that connection between the gut microbiome and hormones. It's like they're all interplaying, right? And so, you've said before that the gut microbiome does more than just help with the detoxification of estrogen, which is important. So let's talk about that. And then let's talk about how this all fits together because we get so much information about the gut microbiome and metabolic health and hormones. Like it feels like it's all separate things that we have to tackle in different ways. But I think what I'm trying to get at is that I know from your perspective, they're all connected. But what's that connection there?
Yeah, and then like I'm smiling as you say this because yes, it is kind of hard to understand, but this is so fascinating.
Right.
And this was proven a while back. So many years ago, there were these landmark studies that basically showed that individuals who eat identical meals will have a different blood sugar response. Again, you and I just spoke about blood sugar
Mhm.
and how that's like cornerstone to metabolic function, right? So
Sure.
again, identical meals. So, what could explain the difference between that? And they found that the microbiome composition actually had everything to do with the difference of that blood sugar response of that meal. So, that is just one example where I'm like, this is fascinating, and we have to understand both of these are interconnected. So, let's say if we have a very dysbiotic, dysregulated, if you will, gut microbiome, typically that is going to also correlate with a not optimal metabolic function, right? Because these two are
Sure.
interplaying back and forth. So that's the blood sugar end. Now, remember too, you have the gut microbiome composition. Depending on what you eat, those little microbes in your gut like eat it up, right? And they produce metabolites that also help inform your metabolic function via inflammation levels in your body. So this stuff is
Mhm.
so cool, right? And again, inflammation levels, you can think of that impacts how hormones function, so on and so forth. Fascinating stuff,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. And so, I mean, what you're saying is that depending on what you're feeding your body, quite literally, with the food that you're putting into your body, you're either feeding the good microbiome or the bad microbiome. And then that has an effect on your metabolic health with relation to your sugar levels, et cetera. And then everything just kind of plays back and forth, right? I mean, that can cause a lot of stress for people of like, oh
No,
my gosh, I screw it up, you know?
yeah, no,
Yep.
not at all. So what's very cool is I actually see it as a way that, hey, you can leverage two kind of different systems and how
Sure.
they interplay. You can use this to your advantage. So
Right.
I'll give you some examples of how there's almost near identical crossover in what I'm about to say. So, for the gut microbiome, think about it from a bigger picture. So, what can lead to a disrupted gut microbiome, or what we call again dysbiosis? It's going to be everything that you and I just talked about from the nutrition aspect. So, if you are having a standard American diet with a bunch of added sugar, with a bunch of simple white refined carbohydrates, you're essentially feeding bacteria in your gut different metabolites that aren't going to be supportive of our health. That's not going to be
Sure.
anti-inflammatory, right? So
Right.
it's going to be like again the high sugar processed diet, standard American diet that feeds a different group of microbes, and that's just
Sure.
not going to be supportive of our
Mhm.
health. Now there's a bunch of other things, sure, like repeated antibiotic exposure, stress, these sorts of things, but no, diet is going to be the biggest leverage, and like I see it as kind of hitting two birds with one stone type
Sure.
of scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so many people know that food is medicine, and that's such a huge lever for your health just in general. And I think that so many women tend to forget the connection between all of these. Anything that's going on with their hormones is also influenced by what they're eating because it's influencing the gut microbiome. It's influencing, it's all connected. But then there's another piece here, which I know that is really important to you and you talk a lot about, which is environmental toxins. That's a big topic. And again, it can be really hard to put your arms around. I know that you mentioned in your book that women with the highest cumulative exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals will enter menopause an average of 4 years earlier, right? And so for a woman who's in her 30s trying to conceive, that's not really just a menopause stat. That's a fertility statistic, right? That actually is affecting their fertility. So if you could tell a woman to, change maybe three things in her daily life to help with the environmental toxin exposure, what would you tell her to do?
Yeah, how I kind of like to explain it is think of these environmental chemicals, the endocrine disrupting chemicals. I think of it almost like pressing the gas. It's accelerating ovarian aging, what's called premature ovarian insufficiency, right? POI. So for all women listening to this, it's very, very relevant no matter the stage of life. It just manifests differently depending on kind of what the goal
Sure.
that we're at. So yes, let's go through kind of some top takeaways and how I think about it. First, in terms of the philosophy, I see what's on the internet. I see what's on social media. It's very like, how can you not be fearful when you listen to some of these podcasts, talking about it? And I I want to empower women with these simple steps and just tackle little areas of their life in a way that is not overwhelming.
Sure.
I would love to go over kind of the big three ways to reduce cumulative exposure.
Sure.
But again, all of the little ways that are things like, okay, replacing plastic bottles. If you get coffee every day, bringing your own stainless steel mug to the coffee shop, right? When you're out of your favorite lotion, maybe that's a time to like be like, oh, well, I should probably take a lotion that does have 20 different ingredients that I don't even know what's in
Sure.
here to say, like, simplify.
Mhm.
So again, it's kind of simplifying the routine and tackling different things that is very doable for women. So the three kind of main buckets that we can reduce our exposure, one is the food category. So the less packaged, processed, and takeout food that we have, the better,
Mhm.
because the more processing a food has along the supply chain, the more opportunity it has to accumulate chemicals along the way. So that's one category. The second category is the water supply. So a reverse osmosis filter is the gold standard in this
Mhm.
category. It's a little bit more expensive, but it lasts a really long time. So that's one where, again, all of the exposure to different things. They can be phthalates, PFAS, BPA, there's so many things, but again, collective exposure. The third one is the indoor air quality. And this one actually is kind of most surprising to me. So, not the outdoor air quality, which I mean, we can't really have too much control over depending on where we live, but the indoor air quality. So, what you can do here is look at perhaps getting a small HEPA filter for your room, like an individual unit, right? That's an air purifier, or changing some of the filters in your house, opening your windows more, these sorts of things. They could be, again, very, very simple, but this is what's going to impact the cumulative exposure in your body. And again, this is what impacts your hormones. So this is a piece that we have so many opportunities to improve in our life.
Yeah. And so let me ask you about this. What about simple things like in your kitchen? What's your perspective on nonstick pans? I'd love to know because I know a lot of people are like very stressed out about like how they're cooking, what they're using to cook. And sometimes that can be a simple swap as well.
Oh my gosh, yes. If you're listening to this and you have a nonstick pan, perhaps this is the opportunity to upgrade the cookware. So you could just start with one pan that you're cooking in most often. So nonstick, a Teflon pan that has levels of forever chemicals, so they're called PFAS. And this is one that unfortunately has been found to have a lot of different, let's just call it human outcomes. The reason why I'm wording it that way is because a lot of these chemicals, they have, say, not ideal outcomes in like animal models, right? Or petri dishes, but I like to look at what is having a real effect in humans, specifically in women in terms of their hormone function,
Sure.
as well as men, by the way, and even coming down to sperm quality. Like there's so much research on this. If you can replace your non-stick Teflon pan with one that is stainless steel, cast iron, some ceramic are okay, then this is definitely kind of the first order of business that I would look into.
Okay, amazing. And then, so for women, I hear this all the time that they're struggling either with fertility or just feel like they're not like feeling like themselves in midlife and they feel like they've tried everything. What do you say to that woman? What do you think she's probably missing in what she's tried?
Yeah, I mean, that's hard to say. So if someone comes in and she's truly not feeling herself, like we are going to spend at least an hour, if not 90 minutes, just on that one day, going through really every aspect of her life and seeing like what is even a micro incision point of how we can change what she's doing. Because I think what a lot of people are not understanding or missing out on is essentially thinking about all these micro incision or refinement points throughout the day and how this compounds over time, like say a week and 2 weeks and a month. So people, they innately kind of get this when it comes to money, right? And the compounded effect of money, of like what's in the bank account. But for some reason, I just feel like a lot of people then are disconnected with that compounded effect on our physiology. So what I would say and what I would start with is that like there should never be any discouraging thoughts because of the amount of opportunities that we have. Also, I think it's important to just mention like the state of mind or the framing of perspective
Yeah.
that that individual might be coming in with. I think, the biology of our beliefs, so to speak, do affect a lot in how you are perceiving the world or negative self-talk, right? Our doubts, all of this. I actually think it's really important to think about that element too. And it's really not discussed a lot, I know, on podcasts or at least in doctors' offices, right? I know you talk about it because that's very much kind of part of this innate wisdom and how in our belief of self, right? And our, our perspective of self, how we see ourselves in the world. And so I think that's also a little aspect worth tackling and worth thinking about.
Yeah, I love that. So, Rachel, I have a couple of questions that the listeners pose. So, I'd love to ask you these if that would be okay.
Absolutely. Bring them on.
Okay, great. So one listener said, I'm trying to eat cleaner, but I'm really overwhelmed by all the information about toxins in food. What matters the most when you're thinking about that?
Yeah, what matters the most is, first of all, if you're feeling overwhelmed, that's actually the first opportunity to take a step back. You're probably, trying to digest all of the information that's coming at you on the internet, on social media, friends, family, everyone. So if we can do a few simple steps of if you're eating everything out of a package throughout the day, that's going to be your first refinement point to be like, okay, how can I eat more whole foods? I know it's not sexy, it's not novel, but that is going to be the biggest leverage point of reducing the different endocrine disrupting chemicals in the food supply, hands down.
Okay, that's amazing. Another listener said, I've been told that I am insulin resistant, but I don't actually know what I'm supposed to do from a nutrition standpoint. So, what do I eat to help with this insulin resistant state that I'm in?
Yeah, so essentially what's happening here is that your cells aren't responding to the hormone insulin as it should be, right? And so in order to resensitize that insulin and to improve that insulin number, let's first start stabilizing the protein intake throughout the day. Let's take out a lot of these like I call them beige bombs on the plate. That is going to spike your blood sugar. That's going to increase your insulin levels a lot. So if you can even just start with those two things, you're going to dramatically improve where you're at just in a matter of 1 month. And I've seen this, right? We've done very, very tiny dietary interventions. We do them every day, very, very consistently, and it changes. So remember, if you're ever discouraged by the fact that you have insulin resistance, we can change that so quickly with what you eat in terms of how we stabilize our blood sugar with our plate.
Yeah. So, I call my podcast The Healing Catalyst because I really want to help people make really impactful changes on their health. So, what is one simple thing from your perspective that listeners could start doing today that would really support their metabolic health, no matter where they are on this arc of women's health?
Yeah, this one will probably surprise you, but the one thing that we can do is to stop outsourcing our intuition to other people, to online, to social media, like all of this healing, whether it's optimizing our metabolic function or microbiome health, that is a process that first starts taking place within. And I think we can actually do a much better job at trusting ourselves and our innate wisdom. I don't think anything that you and I discussed today is so novel when it comes
Yes.
to optimizing metabolic health
Right.
that we can also lean into that, right? Our own signs and symptoms our body is telling us. And so that is going to be the greatest starting point for anyone. So again, the one simple thing is just lean into that intuition and literally that gut feeling that you have.
Yeah, yeah. So thank you so much, Rachel. I love that answer because, so much of what my work is based on is really going within to find these answers, like connecting to self again. So I really appreciate that you said that. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. And I love everything that you talked about. So thank you so much for being here.
Yes, absolutely. Again, thank you so much for having me on. It's such a pleasure to be with you and part of your community. So it's a real treasure to be here.
So, what I really appreciated the most about Rachel is that she kept it simple. She didn't get really complicated about what to do to support your metabolic health. And this idea that your metabolic health is the upstream driver of everything your hormones, your fertility, your inflammation, your energy, your body composition that's physiology. And that's Ayurveda. That's what we've understood for thousands of years in Ayurveda. And Rachel really explained the science behind all of this with the specific labs that you should pay attention to. And that's really powerful because now you have language and you have something to bring into your doctor. But you know what really stood out for me? And this is something I think is so important for all of you to really dial into is when she talked about how two people can eat the exact same meal and have a completely different blood sugar response or metabolic response because of their gut microbiome. Now, we know this. In Ayurveda, we've always said that what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. That's the whole foundation of the dosha framework of learning your mind body constitution. But I think for a lot of you listening, this is a really important reminder. It's why the generic advice isn't necessarily working for you. It's why what your friend or your sister swears by doesn't really help you much because your body is different. And as Rachel says, your terrain is different. Okay, so here's your Health RX takeaway from this week's episode. And I also want to give you some of my perspective on this. So, Rachel talked about adding more protein at breakfast and reducing all of the simple carbs, all the stuff that looks kind of beige on your plate. And from a metabolic standpoint, she's absolutely right. Stabilizing your blood sugar early in the day changes everything downstream that comes after your cravings, your energy, your focus, all of it. But here's the Ayurvedic lens that I also want to offer to you, and I think it's important. In Ayurveda, your Agni or your digestive fire is not very strong in the morning. It really peaks in the middle of the day around lunchtime between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. So, loading up on heavy protein that is difficult to digest first thing in the morning can actually be really hard for your body. So, while I agree generally with Rachel, there are a few tweaks I'd like to make. Yes, pull back on the sugar and the simple carbs at breakfast. Keep your morning meal warm, light, and easy to digest, which means that you save your heaviest protein for lunch when your digestive fire, Agni, can actually handle it. But, and this is where it gets personal, it also depends on your dosha. If you're someone with a lot of vata, for example, you might actually need some more grounding protein in the morning because it balances the lightness and the anxiety that vata tends to bring. A pitta, on the other hand, might do well with some protein, but needs to be careful not to overheat their already strong digestive fire. And a kapha might need to keep it really light in the morning because their digestion is naturally slower to get going. So, this is the thing, right? Rachel is right that breakfast really matters. Ayurveda definitely agrees. But what your actual breakfast looks like, that depends on your body, on your dosha. And that's why personalized medicine really matters. That's why knowing your dosha really matters. And so, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, what does that mean for me? Take the free dosha data assessment at myarvasi.com. It's linked in the show notes for you because that's the piece that makes this all really personal. Your metabolic health, your digestion, your energy patterns, it's all connected to your unique constitution. And when you understand that, you stop following generic advice and really start to make choices that work for you and your biology. So head to myarvasi.com. You can take the free assessment. It takes about 5 to 7 minutes, and you'll get your dosha. And then you can also get your personalized weekly health RX. All right, friends, thank you so much for being here. And if this episode connected some dots for you about your metabolic health, please share it with a friend and let me know what you thought. You can send me a message over direct message in Instagram or send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, please leave a review for the podcast. It really helps for more people to find it. And remember, healing isn't just possible, it's in your power. Until next time, be well. Thank you for listening to The Healing Catalyst. If you found this episode helpful, please hit follow and share it with a friend. And if you feel inspired, please rate and review because it helps others find this podcast more easily. For more insights and tips, head to my website at avantikumarsingh.com. And to connect with me directly, find me on Instagram at avantikumarsingh. I loved sharing this episode with you. My hope is that you heard something today that sparks a catalyst in your healing journey and helps you build lasting health. Be well, and I'll see you next time. This is a Dante 32 production.